So you may get a notification asking you to consent to the recording, but otherwise, welcome everybody. My name is Sandy Fazeli. I'm with the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO. We're really excited to host today's meeting in partnership with E for the Future, our partners who have been helping us unpack some of the questions surrounding the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and other key issues. If you can plan to keep yourself on mute, that would be greatly appreciated. Just a few quick meeting logistics. The meeting will be recorded and posted on NASEO's Infrastructure Hub within the next few days. We'll plan to send a note to NASEO members letting you know when that's happened. We are also encouraging a lot of discussion and questions from you all, especially as state energy offices on the front lines of Infrastructure Act implementation. We'd like to know what your questions are and challenges are, and hopefully Dan can help address and ease some of those today. In the meantime, please do keep your microphone muted. You can use the raise hand feature or the chat feature to share questions or comments throughout the hour. And then just to highlight sort of the run of show for today, we'll have some introductory remarks from David Terry of NASEO and Pat Stanton with E for the Future. Next, we'll also invite Molly Cripps with the state of Tennessee to share some of her perspectives and experiences having navigated Buy America and other domestic preference issues through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARRA. And then finally, the feature star of today is Dan Kelly, a partner with McCarter English, who offers deep expertise in domestic preference provisions and will be helping answering some questions. So with that, I will turn it over to David and Pat to get us started. Oh, David, looks like you're on mute.
Thank you, Sandy, and thanks everybody for joining today. And I know many of you have joined our ECBG and implementation calls before, but just as a reminder, as Sandy noted, E for the Future has been our partner in this work and contributed a great deal, and also the many states that have helped provide input along the way in all of this work. And I think it's timely today that we have Dan on to talk about Buy America. The White House released a new document on this topic today. We are still digging into that, so we'll, I'm sure, hear more about that and read more about that, but it was exceptional timing, Sandy and Pat, so thank you for arranging that, however that happened. And also, just wanted to mention two things. Molly, who will be speaking with us later, the director from Tennessee, she is one of a handful of directors that have gone through ARRA and ECBG and many of these issues, and I know she has a lot of great ideas to relay, so appreciate her time. And maybe just one last plug, we do have on the NASEO website our Infrastructure Hub, which includes an RFP library. So if you're on the call and you have an RFP that relates to any of the topics we've been dealing with in ECBG or infrastructure implementation, in any different category or area, we appreciate having those from states, just so people can share those and learn from them if they're public documents, of course. So I will pause there and again, just thank everybody for digging in to the important part of today's discussion and turn it to Molly Cripps, or excuse me, turn it to Pat Stanton of E for the Future. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, David. And just briefly, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. You couldn't have had the timing turn out to be better, and I know that Dan has dug in and to the memo and will help people get some sense in this really complicated world. And I want to thank Dan for preparing a lot of background materials that will be really helpful for people just to even know where to start. So with that, I'll turn it over to Molly.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and big thanks to NASEO and to E4 for getting this pulled together. State energy offices and local governments, we very much appreciate your partnership and your attention to our concerns. I know we've been very vocal about Buy America being one of those major concerns, particularly because of our experiences under the Recovery Act. So for those who were involved in the Recovery Act and those who were not, touch on a few of the items that we have shared with E for the Future and NASEO that have resulted in these concerns. The major one was, I think a number of states experienced issues with obtaining waivers. So if you haven't had a chance to dig into the document that OMB has released, it does address the waiver process. However, note that all of the federal agencies are then to go to the next step and address other items in terms of how they will respond to waiver requests. But as NASEO has cautioned us before, as well as DOE, whether a waiver process will be that fruitful for us remains to be seen. But do note that there are, I believe it's 3 different categories of potential waiver requests that are addressed in that memo. The other takeaway from Recovery Act to speak to is the amount of education we had to engage in, not just with our own staff, but subrecipients. We know particularly for EECBG, you will be dealing with some very small communities. And oftentimes you are dealing with persons who may be the mayor, and then they're also running the sewer plant, and then they're also seeing to paying the bills, et cetera. And so they don't have grant writers on staff. They don't have persons on staff who are well-versed in various and sundry federal compliance requirements. So those are the ones that we have to do a bit more hand-holding with. But we found out that even with some of the larger local governments that we worked with under EECBG or under other programs, large businesses, this was still foreign to them, and that they hadn't had to deal with it at all, or they dealt with it very little, or their experiences in dealing with it. Perhaps there was not somebody on the other end who were the compliance hawks that state energy offices are, and perhaps some wrong determinations were made along the way in their experience. So I mentioned this just to remind folks that a very key focus that we are all going to have before us is educating our staff, educating our subrecipients, and educating the vendors that we'll be dealing with directly, or that our subrecipients will be dealing with. So hopefully that's something we can lean on each other for and be able to pull together.
Wally, come. I'm trying to help you.
So hopefully we will be able to, if somebody can mute their line, we've got somebody I think is working with a dog maybe. Just if we can lean on each other and pull back together with NASEO and also E for the Future, that might be another area where we can all work together and have some items that we can then push out to those vendors, and or rather a training session that we can have with those vendors, subrecipients, et cetera. Don't be afraid also to reach out to your DOE project officers. They might be aware of another state that has walked through either a waiver process or is dealing with a certain item very similar to what you are going to be dealing with. So keep that in mind, and also know, of course, NASEO and E4 being a resource there. So as we move along with these processes as states, if we can continue to share those with NASEO and E4, that would be very helpful. And that way we'll be able to connect folks more quickly. So I won't take up any more of our time. I'm very excited to hear from Dan. And so Sandy, I will turn it back over to you, but thanks to everyone again for joining.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly and Pat and David, for those opening remarks. I think it really helps frame what we'll be learning from Dan next. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Dan Kelly, the partner of McCarter and English, to walk us through his presentation.
Hey everyone, can you see my slides?
Not yet. Have you shared your screen?
Let's see. How's that?
Yep, that looks perfect. Thanks, Dan.
All right, so welcome everybody. It's really a pleasure to talk to all of you. I have been asked, first of all, thank you, David, for inviting me, and Molly and Pat for giving me a little bit of guidance in terms of what we want to do today. And what we've decided is to sort of give you a whirlwind tour on everything Buy American, both at the federal and state level, because I think it's important to give you some perspective and background with regard to these terms, which are used interchangeably in many different circumstances and apply to different programs, and have, although they may use the same terminology, they work very differently depending upon the context. I'm concentrating the vast majority of this presentation on the reforms that have been implemented by that guy right there, who promised that we'll buy America to make sure everything from the deck of an aircraft carrier to the steel on highway guardrails is made in America from beginning to end, all of it. Well, that's not exactly true, but that certainly isn't the intent of this administration, to make more rigorous the domestic preference laws and rules that apply both at the federal level and at the state level when using federal financial assistance funds. So here's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to talk first about the state of the art today with regard to the federal procurement domestic preference restrictions, known or grouped under the Buy American Act and its exceptions. Then I'm going to talk about the current restrictions on federal financial assistance programs. Most of those are represented by the Buy America Acts, which apply to various departments within the, or agencies or sub-agencies within the Department of Transportation, and something that all of you may be somewhat familiar with if you've been involved with grants that have come down or cooperative agreements that have come down through one of the DOT agencies to the state. I'm going to focus a little bit on the FTA and the Federal Highway Administration. Each of those have separate Buy America Act provisions, which are somewhat different. And one of the reasons I'm going to focus on that is because the terminology, the definitions, the waivers, for instance, and the reasons for waivers are very similar to the waivers and the terminology that you see in the infrastructure statute. But you'll see that there are some differences between the two, and what happens when you have funds, a project that is funded by the FTA or funded by the FHWA, which may have more rigorous or less rigorous restrictions than are in the Build America, Buy America provisions of the infrastructure statute. How do those intersect, and how do we figure it out? So I'm going to go through these Biden reforms. I'm going to talk about the regulatory changes that were made to the Buy American Act recently in the last year. I'm going to talk about the executive order that was launched at the beginning of the Biden administration, which set out the framework for many of these changes that have already been implemented, either through the statute, the Infrastructure Act, or through regulatory changes, and some things to watch for the future. I'm going to talk about the domestic preference restrictions on future federal financial infrastructure projects that are embedded within the Infrastructure Act. As you all know, and we're told that I had my slides all done and ready to go for this presentation several days ago, and then boom, this new memorandum was dropped just 2 days ago, and I took a great deal of time to read through it and incorporate it in this presentation. It was going to be my plan at the beginning of this to say, well, we don't have any regulations yet. We don't have any real guidelines yet. We just have the statute. So let's wait and see, in terms of what the requirements are going to be. Well, now we have some binding guidance that's effective May 14th from OMB with regard to infrastructure projects that are, and it's not just that are funded by the infrastructure statute, but all federally financed assistance infrastructure projects are now going to be subject to these new rules, with a couple of exceptions, which we'll talk about. And then finally, if we have time, I'll go over to the changes to the Buy American Act, which are also in the infrastructure statute. The infrastructure statute not only gave $1.3 trillion money for new and infrastructure improvements to existing infrastructure. It also changed the rules with regard to both the federal procurement, domestic preference restrictions, the Buy American Act, and also the restrictions that exist or with regard to state projects that are run by states and municipalities and universities and other nonprofits that receive grants from federal agencies, and not just the Department of Transportation. That's a lot. If you have questions, I'm going to try to be cognizant of them, but I'm also going to try to get through this because I think it's important. I'm happy to answer questions. You've got my email address. I'm happy to provide this slide presentation to all of you. Perhaps we could even schedule a follow-up session where we could go over those questions. I'm more than happy to do that. Why don't we go? So domestic preference generally. So there's, as I mentioned to you in the introduction, there's a variety of different vehicles that are used. I don't think I need to say much more than that because I think I covered in the table of contents. Let's talk about first the Buy American Act. Now, the Buy American Act applies to FAR-based procurements, that is, procurements that are made by federal agencies at the federal level. It is actually not a prohibition, but it is a preference which establishes in competitive procurements, not sole source procurements, but competitive procurements, where if there are two competing offers, one of which offers what's qualifies as a domestic end product and one which qualifies as a foreign end product, the foreign end product is not excluded from that competition, but the foreign end product is when its offered price is reviewed or offered estimated cost is reviewed, a certain percentage of that cost is going to be put on top of that for purposes of evaluating the cost to determine which is the low offer. So, for example, right now, if I were competing, if I were a small business and I were competing against a company that offered a foreign end product, and I offered $100, and the other competitor offered $100, and that competitor was offering a foreign end product, and I was offering a domestic end product, 30% of that $100 of the offer by the foreign end product offeror would be added, so that when reviewing the offers made, their offer would be looked at as an offer for $130. Mine would be looked at for $100. That's the standard for small businesses. For large businesses, it's 20%, and if you're doing business with DoD, there's a 50% preference that's added when evaluating offers, competitive offers between end products and foreign end products and domestic end products. There is now a different standard for end products, which consist of wholly or predominantly of iron and steel. You'll see that a constant theme within all of these domestic preference statutes and regulations, a different standard for iron and steel products. You see that in the domestic preference obligations for federal financial assistance awards under the IIJA. There's different policies under the Buy American Act for supplies and construction materials. It is applicable to both supplies and construction materials. There's a specific definition for construction materials under the Buy American Act, and that is, you see it in the last bullet, an article, material, or supply brought to the construction site by a contractor or subcontractor for incorporation into the building or work. Now, the big takeaway from the Buy American Act is, what is a domestic end product? And a domestic end product under the Buy American Act has a two-part test. It has to be manufactured in the United States, and the cost of 50% of the components have to be domestic components. So if you look at the total cost of the components, not the number of components, 50% of those components, the cost of those components for domestic components has to be at least 50%. And when we say components, that's a term of art. We're only talking about first tier components. First tier components, those components that are last put together to make the final end product. Second tier components are not looked at. So all of the first tier components could be made up of non-domestic components. But if that first tier component is manufactured in the United States, it is considered a domestic component. So in summary, the Buy American Act applies to federal procurements under the FAR and under the supplements to the FAR. It is not a prohibition on the supply of foreign end products. It is merely attaches a preference to domestic end products. A domestic end product is defined as one that's manufactured in the United States and also one where 50% of the cost of domestic first tier components, the domestic tier components, 50% are at least 50% of the cost of all of the components. And there's one exception for that component test, and that's COTS items, commercial off-the-shelf items. If you're supplying a COTS item, it only has to be manufactured in the United States, and the agency need not look beyond that for purposes of determining where the components come from. Now, there are a number of exceptions to the Buy American Act. The principal exception, which is the public interest exception, is the Trade Agreements Act. The Trade Agreements Act provides that for certain products and certain construction materials that are manufactured in qualified countries, they are eligible.
Chinese computers, sir.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead, Dan.
Sorry,
I think
Harold,
it was
did you have a comment?
I think it was someone who unmuted themselves on accident. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay. So the principal, as I was saying, the principal exception to the Buy American Act is the Trade Agreements Act, which says that in certain, the United States government, based upon treaties that it has with other countries, is willing to consider products that are manufactured and construction materials that are manufactured in certain qualified countries, mostly NATO countries and some other countries, as if they were domestic end products. And there, it's not a preference, it's a prohibition. So if the Trade Agreements Act applies, the agency can only accept products that are manufactured in either the United States or those qualified countries. Another exception are articles, materials, or supplies that are not mined, produced, or manufactured in the U.S. in sufficient or reasonably available commercial quantities. Those are actually identified in the FAR. We're going to take a look at them a little bit later because this exception also applies in connection with certain FTA grants that go to states. Another exception is the unreasonableness exception. That's the one that I talked to you about earlier. That's where instead of a prohibition, a preference is applied to domestic products when competing against foreign end products. One other exception is commercial item information technology equipment, including computers, ancillary equipment, peripheral equipment. Those are not subject to the Buy American Act domestic product requirements. And then finally, one involving goods acquired under commissary resales, which we don't need to spend any more time on. Now let's look, so that's the Buy American Act. Now let's look at the financial assistance programs that exist right now with regard to infrastructure that are where domestic preference requirements are codified by statute. They all fall under the Department of Transportation. As you can see, the Department of Transportation has been very, very active. $70 billion in grants and loans for the development of transportation infrastructure improvements and the purchase of equipment. Now with this, with this, we've got these specific statutes, which are called Buy America statutes, which are applicable to these different agencies: FDA, Federal Railroad Administration, the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Aviation Administration, and Amtrak. I'm going to examine the Federal Transit Administration and the Federal Highway Administration for a few minutes to talk about how these work. And again, some of you may have had dealings with grants which have been funded under these statutes. So for the FTA says is applicable to steel, iron, and manufactured goods that are used in FTA funded projects. And what the FTA Buy America statute says is that they must be produced in the United States. We're going to talk about what that means. And there are waivers which are allowed by the Secretary of Transportation. And these waivers should look very familiar to you because the same terminology is used in the infrastructure statute. It will be used in connection with the EECB grants and any other grants that spring from the Infrastructure Act, and any grants that involve from this point forward infrastructure projects that are funded by the federal government that flow through to states and municipalities and other third parties. So the three exceptions, again, are inconsistent with the public interest, not produced in sufficient, reasonable, available amount, or not of satisfactory quality, or they including the domestic material. The domestic components will increase the cost of the overall project by more than 25%. So the public interest exception, the non-availability exception, and the unreasonable cost exception, right? So for iron and steel, one of the things that the FTA requires is that all of the manufacturing processes must take place in the United States. Now, that's a term of art in terms of what those manufacturing processes are. There is an exception which says except metallurgical process involving the refinement of steel additives. But from the beginning to the end of the production of these iron and steel products, they have to be manufactured in the United States. Now, the FTA has no mention of construction materials, unlike the Buy American Act, except with regard to construction materials that are made primarily of iron and steel that are used in infrastructure projects. So unlike the Buy American Act, and as you'll see, unlike the reforms that are included in the infrastructure statute, the FTA does not address or concern itself with construction materials and whether they are produced in the United States unless they are made primarily of iron and steel, right? These requirements, as you see in the last bullet, do not apply to steel or iron that's used as components or subcomponents of manufactured products or of rolling stock. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. Now, with regard to manufactured products, here's the test. All of the manufacturing processes for the product have to take place in the United States. You can't just have final assembly in the United States like you may perhaps can have under the Buy American Act. And all of the components of the product must be of US origin. Now that's different from the Buy American Act, and as you'll see, it's different from the Infrastructure Act component requirements. And again, not 50%, all of the components of the product must be of US origin. Now this does not, now you're thinking, oh my God, everything that goes into the product that is financed through one of these grants that's used with an infrastructure project has to come from the United States? No. Again, the word component is a term of art. It only means first tier components. It does not include subcomponents. It does not include raw materials that are included within the product, the manufactured product. The test only applies to the first tier components. Then there is a whole other section of the FTA involving rolling stock. Some of you may be familiar with this. So if we're talking about transit vehicles, such as buses, vans, cars, rail cars, trolley cars, ferry boats, if it's FTA financed, the test is not all of the components must be of US origin. The test is the cost of the components produced in the United States must be more than 70%, right? That's still a high threshold, but it's not 100%. But here there's even more of a twist, because for rolling stock under FTA grants, you're looking at the cost of components and subcomponents. And when I say subcomponents, I mean first tier subcomponents. So you can have first tier subcomponents, you can have second tier subcomponents, you can have third tier subcomponents. Are you all completely confused? I hope not. So yes, so when a company and when a state agency, and I, for many years, represented the MBTA in Boston and the Department of Transportation. So I was on your side for many years in terms of trying to evaluate these requirements and what they mean and how to flow them down into contracts. But if you're acquiring under the, and I'm spending a little bit of time on this because what the Infrastructure Act says, that if a statute, if a pre-existing statute is more rigorous than the statute than the requirements that are in the Infrastructure Act, they're going to stay, they're going to remain. So if you, as an energy officer, find yourself in a position where you're cooperating with your state Department of Transportation for the supply of electronic vehicles, for instance, you're going to be looking at this test and you're going to have to make a determination, and you're going to be asked for guidance from your prospective offerors, your contractors, your grantees, your subrecipients, as to whether in fact they're going to comply with this test. So for rolling stock, you need to do an examination and a disclosure, obviously, of all of the first tier components and all of the first tier subcomponents and the costs of each of those. And there's a whole, I can't even get into how you calculate those costs, but there is case law and policy and guidance on what cost means. So when you're calculating the cost of a domestic component, there's material to describe and help you what that means. All right. So just again, to summarize, for FTA, doesn't deal with construction materials unless they're predominantly iron and steel. For iron and steel products, they have to be manufactured. The manufacturing process has to take place entirely in the United States. For manufactured products, the manufacturing processes have to take place in the United States, and all of the first tier components have to be of US origin, unless we're talking about rolling stock, where then we're looking at a 70% test, but we're looking at both components and subcomponents, first tier subcomponents. All right. Now, there is a waiver, a public interest waiver under the FTA. I'm not going to go into the various guidance that I have in these slides, which comes out of the regulations as to how you apply for a public interest waiver, when the FTA administrator can make a determination as to whether there's a waiver or not. I know waivers are a big deal, as Molly mentioned, and we're going to talk about the detailed guidance that is included in the memorandum that just came out on the different types of waivers, but they're the same types of waivers. There's the public interest waiver, there's the non-availability waiver, and then there's the price differential waiver. All of those exist for the Infrastructure Act requirements. Here I thought it's important to note that the FTA by regulation has already promulgated general waivers, and the memorandum talks about what happens to these general waivers to the extent that they're inconsistent with the Infrastructure Act. I'm just going to call it BABA or BABA, because that's the section, the Build America, Buy America section of the Infrastructure Act, which addresses these specific requirements. So if you've got an FTA-funded project, the FTA has already decided that they're going to waive certain requirements. These are fairly narrow, but there's a question now as to whether these waivers will still apply for FTA-funded projects in the future as a result of the new statute. So one of them, for instance, is there's a waiver for microprocessors and computers and microcomputers. That's very similar to the Buy American Act waiver, if you recall. There's a waiver which applies, that's the first bullet up there, to what the FAR Council has already determined to be unreasonably available in the United States. I'm just going to show you for a second what FAR 25104 says. Here's the list of non-available articles. Some of this is just really interesting and fun, like coffee and cork and cobra venom and water chestnuts. But you'll notice that there are a number of items here that may have some real applicability in the real world for you. If you have an FTA funded project, or you're working, I understand you're in energy, you're not in transportation, but you may work with the respective state departments of transportation on joint projects which are funded through the FTA. So these are already these are exceptions under the Buy American Act, where they can be a foreign end product that's supplied, or if we're looking at components, they're not going to be considered foreign components. If we're looking at second-tier components, they're not going to be considered second-tier components. Another exception here is the $150,000 contract value. So for FTA grants, we don't need to be concerned about the domestic preference requirements for contracts that are less than $150,000. That was based upon the simplified acquisition threshold at the time. Now the simplified acquisition threshold is $250,000, so it's higher than that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So remember that the FTA is established by regulation general waivers, and we'll see what the memorandum says with regard to pre-existing general waivers. That's even more important when it comes to the Federal Highway Administration, okay? So the Federal Highway Administration, the statute, looks very, very similar to the FTA statute. It applies to steel, iron, and manufactured products, and it has the same waivers: public interest, non-availability, and unreasonable price or unreasonable cost. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is the waiver. This is a big waiver. So for federal highway projects, since 1983, they've waived the application of these Buy America requirements to manufactured products that do not include steel and iron components. So if you're supplying a manufactured product that's going to be used in connection with the highway project, it can be a foreign product. It does not have to be produced in the United States. The manufactured products, unless they include steel and iron components, are not going to be looked at under Federal Highway Act project. This, again, is a waiver, not a statutory waiver, but a waiver that was adopted by regulation way back in the early 1980s. And it's a whopping, exception. which the memorandum gives us a clue as to what's going to happen to this exception if, in fact, the funds come out of the Federal Highway Administration. All right. So let's look at what's happened over the course of the last couple of years. We've had a final rule amending the Buy American Act FAR provisions, which we'll talk about in a second. We've had the executive order, which establishes this framework where all of these things are happening, including the Made in America website, which some of you have perhaps visited, the Buy American Act website that some of you have visited, and the more intense involvement of the federal government in reviewing and approving, in some cases, waivers and reviewing the actions of both federal and state officials with regard to the acquisition of products, supplies, construction materials, and whether in fact they're acting in compliance with these requirements. Then we had another rule amending the Buy American Act FAR provisions, which is going to be effective in October of 2022. So we've had two amendments in the last 2 years to the Buy American Act, which made it more difficult for foreign suppliers, more difficult to use foreign components when manufacturing products in the United States. And then we've got the infrastructure IIJA with the BABA sections that were passed in November of 2021. And now finally we have the OMB memo, which just came out a couple of days ago, which gives us some guidance on those BABA restrictions. So in January, just before the administration changed hands, so this was a relic of the Trump administration, under the Buy American Act, for iron and steel products and construction materials, the cost threshold for it to be a domestic product went up from 50% to 95%. And then there was also a new threshold established for domestic construction material. It went from 50% to 55% for it to qualify as a domestic end product. Then we have this executive order which came out. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you'll see that many of the objectives that were included in the executive order have now come true, increasing the numeric threshold for domestic content requirements, increasing the price preferences, the creation of a Made in America office, which we have now within the OMB, the development of a public website. We do have the public website, and a variety of other things which are designed to scrutinize more carefully the use of waivers, both statutory waivers and regulatory waivers. For instance, you'll see in that third bullet, they want to take another look at that FAR table that I showed you to see whether those items really are unavailable at a reasonable cost in the United States. So we may have to get Cobra venom from the United States in the future as a result of the review. I'm glad somebody out there is paying attention and laughing. Thank you. Then we have another rule that's effective in October. This is something that has been percolating for some time now, and that is for the Buy American Act. Remember, for the FDA grants, it has to be 100% when we're talking about the first tier components. For Buy American Act, they're catching up, right? So it's going to be 65% for domestic components. It's going to immediately go to 60%, then it's going to go to 65%, and then it's going to go to 75% by the end of the year, right? We won't talk about these fallback thresholds because we're more interested in the grants than we are in federal procurement. So let's go to the Jobs Act. NASEO has a fantastic website with great resources on it, which tells you all about the types of projects that are included, the infrastructure projects that are included under the Act, including the 500 million, 550 million for the EECBGs, and lots of other really good information. I highly recommend you make use of the resources that are included on their website. They're terrific. I spent a lot of time myself and stole a few things, so thank you very much. But what I really want to talk about is the Build America, Buy America section of the infrastructure statute, which has two parts. One which addresses federal financial assistance programs for infrastructure, and one which strengthens the Buy American Act. And we're going to concentrate on that first part for the remainder of this presentation. Okay. All right. So 70914 of the statute is the application of the Buy American preference with regard to federal financial assistance programs for infrastructure. All right. And it says that each agency is going to ensure that none of the funds available can be used for these infrastructure projects, and that it's all infrastructure projects, not just the ones that are funded by the Act, unless all the iron, steel manufactured products and construction materials used in the infrastructure project are produced in the United States. Now that language looks familiar, doesn't it? You'll notice of the word construction materials are included here, where when we looked at Federal Highway Administration Buy America Act, we looked at the FTA, Federal Transit Authority Buy American Act, it didn't apply to construction materials unless those construction materials were made primarily of iron and steel. So this new statute for infrastructure projects captures construction materials in addition to iron and steel products or components that are used in the project, and also manufactured products. And then it says by mid-May 2022, all the infrastructure projects funded should have domestic preference restrictions, at least as restrictive as those set forth here, at least as restrictive. And what they mean there is that if there are more restrictive provisions, which we saw and which will become self-evident once you see the next few slides, such as the ones in the FTA, those are still going to apply. And the OMB memorandum is making good on this obligation here, because the OMB memorandum is binding guidance, which is effective May 14th, 2022. And although the OMB memorandum parrots much of the language that's in the statute and still leaves open a lot of questions about how it's applied, it does add flesh to the bone with regard to how this is going to work. Okay. So for iron or steel products, this again language should look familiar because it's in the FTA Buy America Act. All the manufacturing processes from the initial melting stage, now there's a definition of manufacturing processes, from the initial melting stage to the application of coatings must occur in the United States. Now for manufactured products, this should look familiar to you. The manufactured product was manufactured in the United States, all right? It doesn't say all the manufacturing processes occur in the United States. It just says the manufactured product was manufactured in the United States. So that leaves open the issue as to whether, like under the Buy American Act, it can be assembled in the United States, merely assembled in the United States, or whether something more has to happen for it to qualify as a domestic manufactured product. And unlike the FTA, the cost of the domestic components have to be greater than 55% of the total cost of all the components. Now, the 55% standard is the standard right now under the Buy American Act. It's going to go up to 60% in October, and it's going to keep going up. But for purposes of infrastructure projects funded by the federal government flowing through the states and municipalities. The test for what a domestic manufactured product is manufactured in the United States and 55% of the cost of the components, right? And when they say components, they mean first tier components. They don't mean subcomponents. And note in number 2 there, the unless part, unless another standard for determining the minimum amount has been established under applicable law or regulation. So what does that mean? I mean, does that mean if the standard, like the Federal Highway Administration, that doesn't apply to manufactured products, there's a waiver there? Does that mean for those funded by the Federal Highway Administration, we're not going to be bound by this? I don't think so. But what I do think it means, what I do think it means, though, is if the standard is higher, like you see in the FTA, if it's an FTA-funded grant, we're going to look to 100%. Unless it's rolling stock, we're going to look at 70% for components and first-tier subcomponents. And then for construction materials, it says all the manufacturing processes for the construction material occur in the United States. Again, that phrase, all the manufacturing processes from beginning to end. And the memorandum will give us some clue as to what a construction material is, because it's not defined in the statute. And it's not the same, by the way, as how a construction material is defined under the Buy American Act. And the memorandum will give us some clue as to what all manufacturing processes mean in connection with construction materials. All right, so waivers, same types of waivers that we saw before. There's a public interest waiver, there's a non-availability waiver, and there's an unreasonable cost waiver, which looks again to that 25%. And the 25% applies to the cost of the overall project, not the cost of the difference between the domestic product or that the iron and steel product or the manufactured product. We're talking about cost of the overall project because of the cost of that iron and steel or manufactured products or construction materials. That's going to be the tipping point for purposes of making a determination of unreasonableness, right? But to get all of these waivers, that's where we look to the memorandum for purposes of understanding how these waivers are going to work. And even there, I think, perhaps Molly will agree with me, it's still not completely clear when we trickle down all the way to a municipality or a state, going on a project by project basis, how that waiver process is going to flow up the chain if in fact you have a competitive offering where one or more of the competitors is offering to supply or build the project, which is going to involve foreign iron and steel or foreign manufactured products. All right, so the statute says that you have to, that the waiver will not be issued by the state. The waiver will be issued by the federal agency, the funding agency, and it provides that it has to be transparent, it has to be published on a website, and there has to be a comment period. Now that's more fully fleshed out in the memo. Now, the statute said that within 60 days of the enactment of the act, each federal agency was required to submit a report on what's called deficient programs. And those deficient programs you can see on the slide here are those that aren't consistent with the requirements of the BABA. And the Department of Transportation issued this. This is like 50 pages. They summarized all of their Buy America provisions. And then at the end, they said which ones were inconsistent And they noted, for instance, that the Federal Highway Administration has a waiver which waives all manufactured products. The Department of Energy, which you folks are much more familiar with, also submitted its identification of federal financial assistance programs. And what they basically said is, we don't have a statute, we don't have a regulation which imposes any domestic preference requirements with regard to projects which the DOE funds. So all of our programs are deficient in the sense that they don't have any domestic preference restrictions. I actually have links to each of these reports, and in addition to NASEO's website, this is a great website as well, the American Economic Association. This is a great link. And again, we'd be happy to share these slides with you in terms of what's happening at the state level, what's happening at the federal level, at OMB, at the various agencies. So I highly recommend that site. So let's talk about the memo. In my last, 5 minutes? Is that how much I have, Pat?
That's correct.
So really important part of the memo is that it's effective May 14th. It's effective for all new awards, including renewals of existing awards. It doesn't matter what if there's a solicitation which is outstanding, that solicitation now has to be amended to make sure that it complies with these requirements. Agencies have to comply with Section 70914, including the Buy America preference in the terms and conditions of each federal financial assistance award of an infrastructure project. And let me just skip to definitions. So they do define what a federal financial assistance means, and it's very broad. Assistance that non-federal entities, states, local governments, universities, nonprofits receive in the form of grants, cooperative agreements, non-cash contributions, donations of property, loans, loan guarantees, any type of financial assistance. So your state may very well be the recipient of loans or donations of property or other types of assistance, which we don't traditionally call a grant, which is going to rope in these requirements. And then the definition of infrastructure, it's in the statute, and it includes, among other things, energy-related infrastructure, including electrical transmission facilities and systems and utilities. But it added this last line: infrastructure includes, this isn't in the statute, includes facilities that generate, transport, and distribute energy, right? So any funding or financial assistance, I won't even say funding because it can be a non-cash contribution, that involves these type of infrastructure projects are going to be subject to these requirements. All right. And then what are the requirements? This is pretty much from the statute. Iron and steel, all manufacturing processes from the initial melting stage to the application of the coatings, that was already in the statute. Manufactured products used in a project. The term project is defined in the memorandum as an activity related to the construction, maintenance, or repair of infrastructure in the United States, related to the construction, maintenance, or repair of infrastructure. And it does say the 55% will apply unless another standard for determining the minimum amount of domestic content has been established by law, right? Same thing in the statute. And then there's preliminary guidance in terms of what all manufacturing processes mean for construction materials. That guidance is that it should at least be the final manufacturing process and the immediately preceding manufacturing stage. Now, interestingly enough, there is a definition of construction materials which is quite narrow. It is not like the Buy American Act construction material definition, which is anything that's brought to the site, and incorporated into the project is a construction material. That's not true. It is not an item of primarily iron or steel. It is not a manufactured product. It is not cement. It is not aggregate such as stone. It is a non-ferrous metal, a plastic and polymer-based product. It is glass, lumber, or drywall. And if in fact any one of these or one of these are combined, any one of these is combined into another, or one of these is combined into something else, then it's no longer a construction material, it's a manufactured product. And that's important because remember, construction materials 100% have to be manufactured in the United States. But if it's a manufactured product, then you're looking at the 55% test, right? And they give an example. A plastic frame sliding window is not a construction material, but a plate glass is a construction material. And then finally, let's get to the last couple of minutes here, waivers, all right? Waivers are supposed to be targeted to specific products or projects. They don't like general waivers. The agency has to publish on its website by April 29th a detailed written explanation for the proposed waiver determination and provide at least 15 days for public comment, 30 days for general applicability waivers. That's the federal agency. So for states, you need to get it up to the federal agency, which then in turn must publish on its own site, right? It must be cross-posted to a centralized waiver transparency site managed by the GSA, no later than November 25th of this year. And then for waivers of broader applicability, it then has to go to the Made in America office for public comment. So there's two levels of comment that are going to take place for waivers that are not specific to a particular product or project, right? And there has to be a certification submitted by the federal agency that there was a good faith effort to solicit bids for domestic products. And then also a statement of waiver justification describing the efforts that were made, right? And there's a whole laundry list of things in the memorandum which you have to list in that statement of waiver justification. And then my final point that I wanted to make, that there are some suggestions for public interest waivers. One of them is small grants, some below the simplified acquisition threshold, ones which involve minor iron and steel components, and a few others that are interesting. But I guess my final point here is what happens to the existing general applicability waivers, right? Like, for instance, the waiver that the Federal Highway Administration has for manufactured products. Well, there are instructions here. So these have to be reviewed every 5 years. No later than November 15, 2022, agencies with existing non-product specific general applicability waivers issued more than 5 years before have to conduct a review as to whether in fact it's a rigorous review as to whether in fact it should be continued. And then there has to be documentation, adequate documentation for purposes of continuing that general waiver. And then, sorry, I want to go back.
And Dan, this is, I will just note we are a few minutes past the hour.
All right, I will stop and thank you for your attention with this incredibly granular presentation. I hope it's helpful. I know it's very hard to sort of digest all of the material that I provided, but I hope there's a few takeaways that you've taken from this presentation. And I'll just say to David and Sandy and Pat that I will make myself available at your disposal in the future to answer any follow-up questions, and we will continue to monitor developments, as I'm sure you will.
Dan, thank you so much. This was chock full of information. I feel like I just got a boot camp in Buy American. And so thank you so much. This was a ton of expertise and really well presented to help us understand the various aspects that state energy offices need to navigate. So thank you for that. We did have a few questions come through in the chat, and what I'd like to propose is that maybe our group touches base internally to help address some of those, and then we can send a follow-up note to the group with some proposed next steps for how to answer those or get the answers that they're looking for, if you're open to it.
Of course, of course.
Perfect. Well, thank you everybody else too for your comments in the chat, for your attention on this really important issue. Thank you, Pat, David, and Molly too for the additional comments at the start of the hour. And thank you all for sticking around a few minutes past what I promised. So have a wonderful day and talk to you soon.